Yeah, so good. Hello, welcome to another wonderful our bookshop event. I'm Ben, owner of our bookshop. I've got Alice over there, which may not appear the same on everyone else's screen, and Dave is below me. So thank you all for joining me, the audience who've come, and it's an absolute honor to be hosting this. Just quickly, you'll notice along the bottom there's a Q&A function. The second half of this show is all about the audience, and we want your questions, please. And if you do want to throw any comments into the chat, I'm sure we'll pick them up as well. So, but without further ado, I would like to hand over to your host for the event, Alice Adams.
Thanks, Ben. I'm delighted to welcome Dave to Tring virtually this evening. You'll have to come in person someday. Pop into the bookshop. Come by, I'll show you the mini meadow, even if you don't want to see it. And as I think Ben mentioned, I worked at the Natural History Museum at our site here in Tring for about 15 years, mostly on exhibitions, events, education programme, pretty much any natural history topic you can think of. Eggs, animal poo, dodos, mammoths, things like that. But even though I moved on in 2018 to work for the Tower of London, I've still got really close links with the Natural History Museum, and I've really kept that interest and picked up that enthusiasm from all the researchers and scientists that I work with them. So back in 2009 I was working at the museum pulling together this family exhibition all about bumblebees and looking for sources of really accessible information, because although we've got some great academics at the museum, they were fantastic, but I was looking for other sources of just really family-friendly information, talking about why the massive decline in bumblebees mattered, and looking for some fantastic ways of inspiring people to get involved and take action. And that's when I first came across Bumblebee Conservation Trust, which you'd founded, 3 years earlier with Ben Darville.
2006.
Oh yeah, it was perfect, really enthusiastic, really engaging. It was brilliant, and best of all, it had the scientific research behind it to back it up. So we promoted the trust as part of the exhibition, and I know actually there's loads of museum members and staff that still wear their little Bumblebee Conservation Trust pin badges. And so I pestered Ben, your colleague back then, for loads of information. So I have to say I'm delighted and a little bit overexcited to be able to throw Bumblebee related questions at you tonight. And yes, I do promise not to spam you with pictures of the mini meadow. So when I was looking at it then, there was some awareness of the plight of pollinators, but I just don't remember it being as widespread. And it feels like there's been quite a big realization, and not just in conservation, that individuals can genuinely make a difference. So it just feels like an absolutely perfect time for your new book, or rather a guide, you might call it, Gardening for Bumblebees. And it's just such a good balance of, again, really engaging, accessible science background, a bit of ID guide, practical gardening advice. And a couple of thoughts sprang up. I was thinking, so you've written lots and lots of books about bees over the years, and I was thinking maybe you had to take a different approach with this one. But also, do you feel that there's been a kind of gradual change in public awareness and in mainstream media coverage in the time that you've been working on it, or any particular really big events that have galvanized and really caught people's attention?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, it's a good question. It's been really interesting and kind of exciting. 20 years ago, people weren't really very interested in pollinators, in bees, and all the interest there was really focused on honeybees, which is just one of 20,000 species of bee. But it's sort of just slowly built up momentum, and it's quite hard to explain exactly what's been driving it. But it's been like a sort of wave building and building, and I've been riding along on that wave, expecting it to crash at any minute, and so far it hasn't. And there's no signs of people losing interest. I think interest now is higher than it ever has been. There've been a few things, I mean, all quite sad things, that I think have maybe driven it along a bit. There was the whole colony collapse disorder and honeybee colonies dying in huge numbers, which was mainly in the United States and happened in 2006, 2007. So about the same time we were just talking about, actually. And that got newspaper coverage all over the world and started, these slightly silly stories where people were saying, this carries on, the honeybees will be extinct within 5 years or whatever, which was never terribly likely. But nonetheless, that I think really kind of, stuck in people's minds. And then more recently, there was a study from Germany about flying insects that was in 2017. This study came out. I was actually one of the authors, but I can't claim to have done terribly much of the work. It was based on this long-term data on flying insect abundance in German nature reserves, and they found that over 26 years the abundance had dropped by 76%. So 3/4 of the insects seem to have disappeared.
Wow.
In sort of half my life, and that again got newspaper headlines around the world, and helped to kind of raise awareness, get people talking about, the significance of bees, and slowly during that time, it's broadened out. Thankfully, it's not all about honeybees anymore. People have realised that pollination is done by thousands of different species of insect. There's still a lot of people who haven't got that message, but at least some have. And I think it's kind of nice because it's one of those areas where, a lot of conservation issues, these big environmental issues, people feel really kind of helpless. Climate change, you feel like your own actions are fairly insignificant, and worse still when you see, I remember watching last summer the rainforests burning on the news, these reports from Brazil, and it just breaks your heart to see, but you don't feel like you can do anything about that. But with insect declines, with wild bee declines, people can get involved. They can do stuff. They can do little things or big things in their garden or any kind of outdoor space they've got access to, and actually see it work. See, like your front garden, you just mentioned that you've made into a wildflower meadow. You actually see the insects arrive. It's really exciting, and you feel like you're actually doing something. So it's kind of empowering and engaging, and I think in that sense, it's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, you certainly get a real sense of, like, not just kind of almost childish delight from it, but a real sense that actually you have made a difference, and that little action does make a difference. And certainly there were lots of so much practical advice in the book where you think, actually, if I just do this one little thing and another one little thing. So when you were putting the book together, because it's quite practical, and obviously it's got gardening advice in there, but you're certainly bee expert rather than gardener, I'm guessing. Did you take quite a different approach when you were putting it together?
Yeah, well, it's very different to my, strange, sorry, I just looked, glancing past the screen, into a pheasant has just wandered into my rabbit trap. I've got a garden. One of the many perils of trying to garden for wildlife, or for anything else actually, is where I live, rabbits. They eat everything. And so I've got these live traps. I catch them and I take them a mile or two down the road. I think they're all coming back. As far as I can tell, I'm not taking them. I don't know what the homing range of a rabbit is, but
can you try marking them like you do with the bees?
I have thought of that, but I couldn't think of a sort of non-painful way for the rabbit of doing it. A bit of coloured paint maybe or something. But anyway, I've got a lot of rabbits and at least one pheasant in my garden, and the pheasant's looking really perturbed because it just got trapped. Anyway, so I was trying to answer a question, wasn't I? Yeah. So I mean, my previous kind of popular science books, I guess you'd call them, are quite different to this new one, because it is more of a practical guide. I guess it's most similar to my previous book, was The Garden Jungle, which is kind of about the creatures that live in gardens, with a chapter on ants and a chapter on worms, and it's kind of full of anecdotes and trying to sort of show people how interesting the stuff that lives in gardens can be, and how this amazing kind of life lives all around us and we often don't notice it. And it's also a bit about the kind of philosophy of wildlife gardening, if that doesn't sound too pretentious, but just about sort of treading more gently. But it's not really a practical guide at all. It doesn't tell you how to do it. So I thought there was, space in the market for a sort of DIY practical nuts and bolts. What do you do? Which plants are the best to grow? How do you make a bee hotel? All these even how to propagate plants rather than buying them all from the garden centre where they're probably all full of pesticides and things like that. And it seems to be doing very well, thankfully. Although it's called gardening for bumblebees, it's really about gardening for pollinators and for insects in general, and really for wildlife in general. But because I'm a bumblebee specialist, and I thought gardening for bumblebees was snappier than gardening for pollinators somehow.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. But I was amazed reading how many different types of pollinator there are, because obviously it's not just bumblebees or even bees or even flies. Did you say there's something like 4,000 different species of pollination in the UK, something like that?
Yeah, some people put the number even higher. We don't really know, is the honest truth, but most butterflies and moths, huge numbers of different types of fly, hoverflies and bee flies and umpteen other types of fly, and lots of beetles, wasps. I'm sorry if I've mentioned wasps, I don't think I have. Bees, of course. So they're all groups with huge numbers of species in them. So yeah, some people reckon maybe 6,000 species contribute to pollination in the UK, but we don't know, the honest truth. It's a huge number, and considering, there are still a few people out there that think that all pollination is done by bees, or worse still, that it's all done by honeybees, which is a long way from the truth. But the word is getting out there, and I think people appreciate now that there's a bit more to pollination than bees.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's only, that knowledge that we've got, that understanding of the fact that all of these different species contribute was, comes down to scientific study and observation. And one of the things that really struck me from your books, and also from, working with so many researchers at the Natural History Museum for years, was that the power of the knowledge. So in terms of, if you're going to have any hope of protecting a living thing, you have to understand its biology, you have to know how it behaves, you have to know what it needs to thrive. But anyone who's trying to identify a living bee zipping around your garden must be thinking, how on earth do you follow a bee to understand its foraging behavior?
With patience, yeah. That's actually how I first got interested in studying. I've always loved insects, and I guess nature generally, from a really young age, but I didn't start specializing in studying bumblebees until I was in my late 20s, I guess, and that was just based on a kind of chance observation. I was sitting, for reasons I've long forgotten, I was sitting in a little nature reserve just outside Southampton, where I was based at the time. And I was just sort of idly watching bumblebees on this patch of comfrey flowers. And I noticed something odd that I couldn't really explain, which was just that as bees fly from flower to flower, obviously, but they very often fly up to a flower with their antennae out, get really close, and at the last second, they veer away as if there's something wrong with it.
Yeah.
Anyone can see this, it happens all the time in our back gardens. But when I kind of looked in books and sort of scientific literature, I couldn't find any explanation. What were they, why were they, how were they discriminating? What was wrong with the flowers they were rejecting somehow? I ended up it took about 5 years to sort of unravel what was happening. It was all work I did I had a PhD student, my first PhD student, Jane Stout, who's now a professor at Trinity College in Ireland. But anyway, she was brilliant. And between us, to cut a very long story short, they're sniffing the flower. And what they're sniffing it for is the smelly footprint of a recent bee visitor. As if they could,
Bees have got smelly feet, is that what you're saying?
They have, well, yeah, basically. Bees are covered in kind of oils, like a bit like the oils on our skin. And when they land on a flower, a little tiny bit of that comes off. Just as when, if you pick up a cup or a glass or whatever and put it down, you leave an oily fingerprint on the glass. So bees leave behind a little kind of oily footprint. And other bees can sniff, and if they detect that someone else has recently landed on that flower, they know that the previous bee will have taken the food, so there's no point in landing because there won't be any nectar or pollen. So it just saves them maybe half a second of time. But given that bees, they might visit 10,000 flowers in a day, then that potentially adds up and helps them to be kind of much more efficient at gathering food than they might otherwise be. Anyway, after 5 years of that, I was kind of hooked, and I had realized how clever they are, and they use, they're the kind of intellectual giants of the insect world, really, bumblebees. They literally have a bigger brain than most insects, although it's still only about the size of a smallish grain of rice. But they basically just clever. They learn all sorts of things. They can learn which flowers are most rewarding, and they memorize the landscape. We did homing experiments with bumblebees as well, where I had nests in my garden and took bees in my car and dropped them off around Hampshire and looked to see how far they could come back from. And
kind of like pigeons, like homing pigeons.
Exactly like pigeons, homing bees. The record was it was about 10 kilometers, which for a little bee, it's pretty. Imagine, if someone stuck you in a dark box where you couldn't see anything and transported you 10 kilometers and dumped you off, you'd probably, you'd probably ask for help fairly quickly. But if you weren't allowed to ask for help and couldn't see the road signs, how would you find your way home?
Oh, I can't even find my way around Milton Keynes shopping centre. I would have no chance.
If you're a bee, you'd probably be fine. So yeah, they're smart basically, and it's one of the kind of fascinating things about them.
So you must have had to devise all kind of like weird, like quite creative experiments. Have you ever had any experiments where it hasn't gone to plan, or the bees have outsmarted you?
There have been so many that have gone wrong over the years. I've had all sorts of disasters with bees. I've got stung umpteen times. I mean, the most painful of my misadventures, I guess, with bees for me was, I don't know if you've come across things called pooters, which entomologists, insect scientists, whatever, make these funny gadgets, which is like a little jar with two tubes coming out of it, one of which goes in your mouth, and the other one you point at small insects, and you can suck on the mouth bit, and that creates a sort of low pressure, sucks up the insect, which goes into the pot. But it's very important that you have a little bit of mesh on the end of the tube going into your mouth, so that they don't go into the pot and then up the next tube and into your mouth. Anyway, I was trying to do experiments. I was trying to move bumblebees between nests. And I thought I'd make a giant bumblebee-sized pooter big enough to suck them up. So I got some big tubing. This is like the
start of an episode of Casualty.
Yeah, well, it could have been. Anyway, you can see where it went. I forgot to put the mesh on. So it worked quite well, but then after the third or fourth bee had been caught, one shot up the tube straight into my mouth. Happy, and having an angry bumblebee in your mouth is not much fun, is it? Obviously it stung me, and my lips puffed up. I looked like an absolute idiot. But
did the bee make it though?
Oh, the bee was fine. I spat it out, and yeah, as I remember,
that's
it was a bit wet.
That kind of enthusiasm and delight and surprise in the studies that you're doing, that really comes across in your writing. And it was making me think about how like early inspiration and curiosity like that really sparks like a lifelong interest. So I guess it reminded me of the founder of the Natural History Museum here in Tring, who some of the people listening I'm sure will know about, Walter Rothschild. He was really fascinated from a young age, and initially by insects. And as an adult, he was really passionate about passing that on. And when I was reading, I've been reading A Sting in the Tail as well, which is brilliant. But reading your early exploits, like your excitement, your attempts at taxidermy, and your well-meaning but, let's say, disastrous efforts with live collections, they just made me gasp, but laugh out loud. But yeah, I was thinking about that early enthusiasm. And is there anything from your own childhood that you would recommend trying or maybe avoiding if somebody wants to spark off interest or encourage a child's interest in bees or the natural world?
Yeah, I mean, most of the things I did, I would discourage strongly, or at least the ones I remember. Yeah, I mean, my earliest memory of bumblebees is in one of the books, and that was me attempting to rescue bumblebees when I was 7 or 8 years old. I found these wet bumblebees that had got caught out in the rain in the middle of summer, and I collected them up, and I had this idea. I put them on the hot plate of the electric cooker, which you can see with hindsight wasn't a brilliant plan, but it was one of these old-fashioned electric ones with the big heavy kind of rings that take ages to heat up. So I put these poor soggy bees on it, and I put a bit of tissue paper over them and put it on the lowest setting, but those old hot plates take ages to warm up. So I got bored and I wandered off, forgot all about the poor bees until, you know, my mum shouted there was smoke in the kitchen, and I ran back, and anyway, the poor bees well and truly frazzled. But yeah, maybe I've been trying to make up for this ever since. I don't know, but
see, you wouldn't recommend that approach.
Don't do that. Don't set light to bees. That's definitely a no-no. I mean, I'm embarrassed a bit, but I used to collect insects, butterflies and other insects. You know, I kill them and put pins through them. Which sounds awful today, and it's thankfully become, you know, just something people don't do anymore, really. But I mean, I was in good company. If you know, people like David Attenborough and Charles Darwin and whatever, they all collected, and that was actually a fantastic way to get into, you know, being interested in learning about insect life. But I guess there's too few insects and too many people these days for that to be a viable option now. But yeah, people can take photographs and they can upload them to websites, databases where the data is all stored and kept, so that you can contribute to monitoring schemes, and you can make a collection using photographs, which wasn't at all easy to do when I was a kid. But with modern, even cameras on mobile phones are good enough to get really good pictures of insects. So you don't need to stick a pin through them. You can make your own collection with nice pictures.
It really helps for ID skills as well. The amount of times where I've not been able to identify something on the blueberry or whatever out the back, managed to get a decent enough picture to then run inside and actually have a look at a book and try and work out what it is that I've seen. So yeah, it works well. But I guess in terms of the museum collections, although people don't tend to make collections anymore, do you find that some of the historic collections are useful in terms of conservation efforts or understanding biology?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and don't get me wrong. I mean, it's fantastic that we have those collections, and we should look after them forever. I was lucky enough a few years ago to go to the Oxford Natural History Museum, where they've got specimens collected by Darwin, you know, with his little neatly written labels and everything. I mean, there's some really useful information. All sorts of types of information can be gleaned from those. I mean, there've been a lot of studies recently published trying to look at how ranges of species have changed over time, looking back at museum collections to see where different species of insect were found in the past, and comparing it to, you know, looking at different slices through time to see how their ranges have changed. And that's really the only window we have back to know what insects were doing, what their populations were like, you know, in the past, because we only really started proper sort of monitoring, counting of insects in the 1970s, and then only for a few insect groups, started with butterflies. But specimens give us a kind of window on the past. And there's also been some really interesting studies on using museum collections of bees, looking like taking pollen grains off the bees, off these museum specimens, to see what flowers they were visiting, you know, back in the 19th century, which, I mean, isn't that kind of cool that you can...
That's amazing. And you think that people that were collecting the bees at the time, they were doing it for a scientific purpose to find them, but I guess a lot of the people who were making these collections could never have anticipated DNA analysis, chemical isotope analysis, and all the ways that, you know, looking at pollen grains, they couldn't have anticipated that.
No, I mean, they'd be amazed, wouldn't they? Imagine, you know, if they would couldn't comprehend the uses that their insects might one day be put to. Of course, we didn't know what the DNA existed when some of these insects were collected.
Yeah, so it's interesting.
Still there.
Yeah, you can use those for working towards conservation efforts which wouldn't necessarily occur to you. And I know that speaking of conservation efforts, there's probably some people in the audience who have been reaching for a copy of Gardening for Bumblebees since they heard that the charity Bug Life launched this Beelines project a few weeks back. So, which I understand aims to create a nationwide network of pathways to help stop the decline. And Tring sits within one of these pathways, which is pretty exciting. I've been Googling my friends' houses and seeing who lives in a pathway. But why is it important to have that network? How will they help?
Yeah, so I mean, the big driver of insect declines has been loss of habitat, and the way that which is kind of gone hand in hand with the way farming has changed and become more intensive. And what used to be insect-rich, biodiverse habitats like hay meadows and so on, which were actually created by farming itself originally, but a much more extensive kind of farming, have all been sort of swept away to create monocultures of crops and silage fields and so on. So now we have insects surviving in little kind of remnant patches of habitat that are left to them, and often those patches are isolated from one another. There's the little tiny populations of insects with no chance of them linking up with any other population, so they become inbred over time, and eventually they're going to go extinct unless we can join them up. So the idea is to both create more habitat, but to try and target specifically making habitat that helps to link existing bits of habitat so that insects can more easily move, and other wildlife too, can more easily move about, and so that populations don't become isolated. So it's a really nice idea, and if you're lucky enough to live near or on a line, then get involved. But even if you're not, what the heck, get involved anyway. Make habitat for insects if you can, because the more the merrier. It doesn't have to be on one of the lines, but it makes sense as a strategy for them to prioritize those areas.
Oh yeah, and I guess as we were saying earlier, even a small action, growing a small patch of flowers makes a difference, because I guess there are so many negative impacts on bees that I guess the more we can do to support them, I guess it makes them more resilient.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we can do a lot in our gardens if enough of us do it. There are about 22 million gardens in the UK, which cover an area of it's nearly 500,000 hectares, which is a bigger area than our nature reserves actually. So just imagine, that they were all bee friendly or wildlife friendly, pesticide free, full of the right kinds of flowers, with a little pond and a bee hotel and a log pile and all the rest of it. And imagine further, we could get the councils on board so that the road verges weren't cut every 5 minutes, and the roundabouts were full of flowers, and the parks were full of flowers, and the cemeteries and all these other sort of urban green spaces. Then we could create a kind of national network of insect-friendly habitat, and it's not just like a fanciful dream. It's actually completely plausible, because it's already happening. People are doing this. Lots of people are trying to kind of make their gardens a little bit wilder, and councils are starting to come on board. And there are lots of parts of the country now where the road verges haven't been blitzed this spring by men with strimmers, and where they're full of dandelions and so on at the moment, which is really encouraging to see. So and it's not going to solve all the world's problems, but it would be a nice step in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I don't know, I guess a few years ago, if you said wildlife garden, people would imagine something a little bit overrun and messy, but I guess there's plenty you can do in your garden, and still have a beautiful garden. And one of the things I've been doing with Gardening for Bumblebees is going around looking at my own garden and looking at gaps where flowers that I don't have, or that don't come out of a particular time of year. And one of the things I was really interested in was the bumblebee year. So you talk about it in quite a lot of depth in a sting in the tail, but it's conveyed really succinctly in Gardening for Bumblebees. And I guess it's when you're thinking about helping bees, it's easy to focus on summer flowering plants, but what about the other seasons?
Yeah, so I mean, bumblebee nests start when the queen, or at least their season starts when the queens come out of hibernation, which can be as early as the end of February if we get a warm day or two, and more commonly March, right through to kind of September. And they need food the whole time. If there's a period where there was no food, then the nests are gonna die. And although it's really hard to study the early stages of nest building in bumblebees, I mean, most people who know about bumblebees agree that it's probably one of the most kind of vulnerable stages of the life cycle, because the poor queen, she's trying to build a nest on her own, which is something that other social insects, most of them don't do. Honeybees, queens are never on their own. Their colonies reproduce by splitting in two, swarming.
So they always have people to do stuff.
Exactly, the queen has a whole army with her the whole time. Whereas a bumblebee queen, you know, she wakes up in early spring and she's on her own. So she has to find a nest and she has to make a little ball of pollen and lay her eggs on it, and she has to incubate the eggs, which means shivering all the time to create warmth, to keep the eggs warm because it's cold at that time of year. And to fuel that, she needs food, so she has to keep dashing off to try and find flowers, but all the time she's away, her brood's going cold, so she has to get back as quick as she can, and she needs pollen to feed to the grubs as they grow and so on. So you can imagine it must be a really stressful time. And if she can't find enough flowers, or she has to fly a long way to find those flowers, then she's not going to make it. So those early spring flowers are probably, you know, the most important things we can provide. And there's not that many to choose from, actually, because, you know, flowers don't tend to, most of our native flowers and a lot of garden flowers just don't flower that early. But pussy willow is really important if you've got room to squeeze one of those in. Pulmonaria is a really nice early season plant which attracts a nice range of bumblebees. Flowering currants, hellebores, grape hyacinth, but that's most of them, actually. There's most of the ones I've got in my garden. But if you've got them there, you know, the bees don't need a huge diversity. They just need something sugary to drink and some pollen to collect.
And I guess, you know, we're all, you know, by the time, you know, we get to the end of winter, we're all desperate for spring as well. And I guess putting anything like that flowers early into your garden, it's great for the bees, but it's so nice to look out the window and have splashes of colour. So, you know, it makes your garden better as well, I guess.
Yeah, it does. And it's, I mean, I think a garden, the movement and noise of buzzing bees and other insects is kind of, you know, makes a garden so much more alive and fun than just a sort of boring, sterile garden. And I mean, if you grow pulmonaria, for example, as well as those hungry bumblebee queens, there's a really good chance you'll get bee flies, which are these amazing, fluffy, round bee mimics with a long kind of snout, which are still on the wing now, but they're early sort of spring insects. And you might get hairy-footed flower bees, which are these beautiful.
I love them.
Bees. Oh, they're fantastic. They're still on the wing. Keep an eye out. Lovely, sort of just a little bit smaller than a bumblebee. And
really, really fluffy.
Yeah, they look like a little fluffy bumblebee. People usually think they are bumblebees. And they're unusual in that the females are jet black, but the males are a kind of fluffy brown. So they look like different species. And the males have these fluffy feet that when they're mating with the female, for some reason, they put their fluffy feet on her face and stroke her eyes. She seems to like it.
Who doesn't like that?
Well, indeed.
Brilliant. And just thinking about the type of species you were talking about, you said a lot of non-native species don't flower early. And I know that there's a mix in your book of native and non-native species. So do you think it's more important to choose native species or to get a nectar-rich food plant out there? I guess, and if you were to recommend choosing one plant or one tree or shrub, which obviously defeats the point of biodiversity, but what would you go for?
Well, so there is evidence that on average, native flowers tend to be a bit more attractive to pollinators than non-natives on average. But there are some non-natives that are amazingly attractive to pollinators. So, you know, it's far from a kind of a reliable rule. But there is also the advantage of natives that if you, as well as pollinators, there are likely to be other insects that might eat the leaves, for example, or feed on the sap or whatever, whereas with non-native plants, that's less likely to be the case because herbivorous insects tend to be more fussy about what they can eat. So, and a familiar example of that are most butterflies, where they'll drink nectar from lots of different flowers, but the caterpillars will only eat one or two types of plant, and they're almost always native plants because our native butterflies have evolved with native plants. So, for example, if you want orange tip butterflies to actually breed in your garden, you need to grow some lady's smock, which is one of the few food plants, and it's a lovely little pretty flower to grow as well. So anyway, native flowers tend to be quite good for pollinators and are good for as food plants. But I mean, my garden's a real hodgepodge of natives and non-natives, because there's lots of really beautiful non-natives that are really attractive to pollinators. And pollinators don't care where a plant is from. They just want a plant that provides them with lots of flowers that are rich in nectar and pollen, and that they can get to the nectar and pollen in. They don't give a stuff whether it's from China or North America or wherever.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't think in gardens, and it wouldn't be realistic to say to people, you know, you must only grow native plants in your garden, because I think I'd probably lose most people at that point, and that would be the end of it. So being realistic, let's just go for a mix. But if you can find a native plant that suits your purpose, and there are loads of beautiful natives to go for, then grow one. And so just if you wanted me to choose a favorite plant, Viper's bugloss or bugloss is a beautiful native wildflower with lovely purple flowers, and bees absolutely love it. And a flowering tree, I'd go for a fruit tree, actually, an apple tree. My garden is full of fruit trees that are all coming into bloom at the moment, and they look amazing. And of course, as well as providing loads of blossom in the spring. Sorry, my dog is barking at the door now.
Is it barking at the pheasant that's in the rabbit trap?
She hasn't noticed the pheasant yet. If she does, I'm really excited. And so, if you grow fruit trees, obviously you get your own 0 food miles fruit. And as the tree grows, it's locking up carbon. So if you can squeeze a fruit tree into your garden, then there's wins all round.
Yeah, and I guess there's always allotments as well. So we're blessed in Tring with a really nice big allotment patch. We have one, and we see loads down there, particularly on the gooseberries, the blackcurrants, and where wild borage and comfrey's springing up. I mean, comfrey's really useful down the allotment for making comfrey tea to fertilize the plot. But the number of pollinators that you see down there in the fruit trees is brilliant. So I guess maybe allotment holders have a part to play as well.
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan of allotments. I wish there were more allotments, because lots of people can't get allotments. So I was chatting to someone earlier who's on the waiting list and has been told it's 20 years before she's likely to get one.
Wow.
Actually, she's quite young, she might make it, but anyway. There are supposed to be 90,000 people on waiting lists for allotments. Isn't that sad? People who want to grow their own food and get involved in, and growing flowers and whatever else they might grow on an allotment, and they can't get the land. I think that's really sad, and government should do more to find that land wherever they can. Because I mean, allotments are just extensions of gardens. They can be really rich in wildlife. It was actually a study from Bristol University published a couple of years ago now, where they looked at the biodiversity of different urban habitats, and allotments came top, better than gardens, and better than even better than urban nature reserves and parks, actually, which I'm surprised. But I guess it's because they're so sort of higgledy-piggledy, aren't they? There's loads of some of them are a bit untidy and full of weeds. Some of them are neat. Some of them have got lots of vegetables. Some of them have got lots of flowers. But overall, there's just lots and lots of diversity, which probably explains why you end up with lots of other wildlife. Sorry, can you hear the dog barking? Shall I?
Only just, not a problem. I'd feel bad if you were to penalise it.
I'm hoping my. Oh no. I was just wondering whether I should go. I was hoping my son would get here and go and get her, but.
Oh, Ben's back.
Yeah.
Ben, we were just talking about you. Not really.
No. I've been here watching all the time. I have to say the audience is remarkably quiet with questions, but I do wonder if my appearance and my urging them to get their questions in might bring a few more. I know I've actually
1 minute. I'm going to get the dog. I'll be back.
Okay.
No problem. Alice, we've lost our star.
Oh no. Well, goodness, don't ask me the questions. I wouldn't have a clue, unless it's about allotments, in which case I might.
How is your allotment?
Yeah, going well. I tell you what, it's been too dry and cold, though. I'm not quite sure what the season's going to be like.
Okay.
We'll see.
Come here, Poppy.
The water butts were empty until the day before yesterday.
We kept things going, Dave.
There she is. There she is. Just so I'd show you the culprit.
What's your dog's name?
Poppy. She's a sort of Heinz 57. I claim she's a Madagascar truffle hound, but
Very rare, very rare.
very, very rare. She is unique, I think, but the last of her kind. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's fine.
Let me throw a few questions. Vicky got her question in first. Vicky, who is Alice's old friend from I'm just going to from the Woodland Trust.
Yeah.
Have you converted any of your French neighbours, which you talk about in a buzz in the meadow?
No is the quick answer. No, I mean, it doesn't help that my French is still appalling, and the local farmers just kind of look totally confused by what I'm trying to do in my field in France. They haven't. I don't think I've managed to articulate that I'm trying to create a wildflower meadow, and I remember years ago when I was sowing patches. I tried to set up an experiment where I sowed lots of patches of different seed mixes in the meadow there, and so I cut it really short and I sprinkled in the seeds, and then I was trampling the seeds in by sort of stamping my feet and walking around in circles in these squares. And I noticed that my neighbouring farmer just standing on the edge of his field watching me as I kind of shuffled around stamping my feet in the middle of a meadow, and he clearly had no idea, that I was trying to trample the seeds in, and just thought I'd completely lost the plot. And anyway, so no, I haven't, is the short answer. The way to go.
I mean, I suspect the French are a lost cause anyway, but anyway, I won't go.
Outrageous.
I'm saying that as a Yorkshireman, so you can blame my roots. Paquita, who's always good for a great question. How important is water accessibility for pollinators?
Not very, actually. They don't drink very much, apart from honeybees. Honeybees in hot weather, they gather water, and they kind of act like little air conditioning units. They use it they evaporate it to cool the hive, to stop it overheating and all the wax melting, which is a problem if you're living in there might be 80,000 bees in a hive, and a hot day in summer it gets really hot. So that's why they have to. But most wild insects don't often drink. You do sometimes see wasps having a bit of a drink for the same reason, but actually they get the moisture they need from nectar usually.
Yes, I was making notes from your the plants for the spring, which I need to get. I invested. We've literally just turned our garden, which was we bought the vets basically in Tring. It was a car park, tarmac, ripped it up, and we're busy building all sorts of stuff. But a wildlife garden is fundamental to that. So I made a note of all those plants you're referring to. What was the vipers one? Sorry, I'm just asking a personal question.
Vipers. Bug loss. Echium vulgare is the
okay. So I've made a note of that. That was purely for me there. Sorry, apologies, audience. I tell you, Polly Eaton. Now in Tring, we're running this little campaign at the moment. Make Tring a bee town, which is an annual little campaign that we run now, which essentially was the inspiration for us hosting this event. So, and Polly, who's sort of admin at the Baptist church next door to the Bookshop, was kind of key in doing this, and she's got a question I've not actually read yet, but I suspect it'll be very good. Do you hold any store by the argument that honeybees can push out bumblebees and other types of bee because of their numbers feeding. I hope not, as I've got honeybees.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, it is true. There's pretty clear scientific evidence that there can be competition between honeybees and wild bees, largely for food. You know, we know there are not enough flowers in the landscape, and a honeybee colony needs a lot of nectar to keep it going. So it takes a lot of the resources from those flowers, and that has impacts on wild pollinators. I mean, that said, I think, you know, I always try to avoid having a row with beekeepers, because they should be allies of people that care about wild insects, because we all want a countryside with more flowers, fewer pesticides. You know, most beekeepers understand that. But there are a few instances. I mean, if you had a situation, for example, where you had a nature reserve with a rare bumblebee living there, it probably wouldn't be a good idea to put a bunch of honeybee hives, because that, you know, really isn't going to help. So a little bit of common sense is required, really, but otherwise I don't think it's such a big deal.
Julie Hamilton, what is the ideal place for a bumblebee to make a nest? That's obviously information we can do to help.
Yeah, well, so most of them nest underground, and the queens fly around looking for holes in the ground, an old mouse hole, rat hole, rabbit hole, and then we'll go down and nest down there. And what she really needs is to find an old nest, because she wants the insulation to use for her own nest to help keep warm. So that's pretty hard to recreate, other than by encouraging rats or something, which is probably not what you want to do. You can buy commercial nest boxes for bumblebees. Most of them don't work very well. The only ones I found that do work are, there's a German design called a Schwegler nest box, which are these giant things. They look a bit like Daleks. They're really ugly in your garden, but bumblebees seem to like them much more than anything else I've tried. But all of that said, there's one species of bumblebee called the tree bumblebee, which likes to nest in tip boxes.
Yes, we've had them in the garden before.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah.
In the garden shed.
So putting up a tip box may well attract that species of bumblebee. And some people get upset because they want the birds to be in them and not the bees. But then I would suggest they just put up another box if they've got.
Yeah, we've just got more than one box. The bumblebees like the shed, and the blue tits like the garage.
Perfect. Everyone's happy.
Right, Virginia, Perth, why are some bumblebees so big and some so small?
Yeah, it's unusual. You know, most insects, I probably don't think about it, but most insects are all the same size for any particular species. And it's even honeybees, they tend to all be the same size, and the queen's a tiny bit bigger, but not much. But bumblebees, so the main difference is that the queen is massive. She's much bigger than, in most bumblebee species, she's much bigger than her daughters, the workers. And that's possibly to help her survive in that early spring period when it's cold and she has to keep warm and shiver and all the rest of it, which obviously being big helps you to keep warm. But then the workers themselves, so they're all daughters of the queen. The males don't do any work in bumblebee nests at all, lazy blighters. The workers, some of them are really tiny and some of them are really big, and everything in between. And partly it's to do with the little ones tend to stay in the nest most of the time, and they're like the nurse bees, and the big ones are sent out to gather food. But if things go wrong and the big ones die or something, then you do sometimes see the little ones out on flowers, but that's usually a sign that things are going badly wrong for that nest. So they basically make different size bees to do different jobs. That's the underlying explanation, but it does confuse people because they think, you know, they think that size ought to be a helpful cue in identifying bumblebees. Actually, it's completely useless because each species comes in a huge range of sizes.
Very good. Alice, I know you've got a couple of other questions. Is now a good time, or shall I give
Oh yes, could I just get in one that I'm quite interested in? So beyond, I'm really keen to do things in the garden, but beyond that, if you're trying to kind of improve your BID skills or take it a step further and get more involved, what kind of citizen science projects are out there that people might want to get involved in?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots from, you know, at its very simplest, you can just take a photograph and upload it to iSpot or iNaturalist as just a kind of way to get started. And that is actually useful. You know, that data is all collated and stored and can be used to help plot out the distributions of species and so on. But if you want to get more involved, there's a little organization called the Buzz Club, which is a kind of citizen science club based at Sussex University that you can find online.
Is that a coincidence that you're based there?
Total coincidence. No, not really. No, I was one of the people that started it. But where we get people to help us do experiments, and we're testing out different things you can do in your garden for wildlife. So, for example, we're just launching a project on getting people to try different designs of earwig hotel to see which ones attract the most earwigs. Or there's the Bumblebee Conservation Trust that we mentioned at the beginning runs bee walks, which is, if you're really keen, it's a really important long-term monitoring scheme for bumblebees that we started back in, I think, 2008. So it's been running for 13 years now, and it's starting to build up a long-term picture of how the numbers of bees are doing. So if you want to do that, you basically have to decide on a local walk that you're willing to do every month, and you walk the same walk every month through the spring and summer, and count and identify the bumblebees you see, which obviously means you need to learn to identify bumblebees, but there's a good challenge. But so there's lots of options.
Thanks, Ben, for letting me jump in.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Right, I've got
my turn.
So Michael Demedecki, is cow parsley useful for pollinators?
Yeah, it's a native flower. I think it's rather beautiful, actually, and you don't see many bees on it, but you see lots of smaller things like flies and little tiny wasps visiting it. And it's relative hogweed, which, you know, just doesn't say, the name puts people off. But that's really, that flowers a little bit later, and that's really good for a lot of different pollinators.
Very good. And H. Lee, how do bees rest in bee hotels, and how long do they stay there if they do go in? Yeah,
so now is peak bee hotel season, actually. So a bee hotel is intended to provide a home for some species of solitary bee, so not bumblebees, not honeybees, that like to nest in horizontal tunnels. And there are at least half a dozen species that use them, but the most common one is a thing called the red mason bee, which is on the wing right now. So it's a good time to make one or put one up. And I've made a YouTube video. If you want to know how to make a bee hotel, go to YouTube and find my site. They basically, so the female bees are just emerging, and they mate, and then they find a hole, and they stock it with little piles of pollen, and they make a little pile of pollen, they lay one egg, and then they build a little clay wall to seal it off, which is why they're called mason bees. And then they repeat the process, and starting at the deepest end of the hole until it's full, and then they cap it with mud, clay, and start again on another hole. Those offspring will stay there for 11 months. So they'll be there right through the rest of the summer, autumn, following, and they'll hatch as, they only have one generation a year, so they'll produce next year's generation of bees. So the bee hotel is occupied for all year round. But most of the year, there's not much activity. Now's the time when you see all the bees buzzing about. For the rest of the year, there are just these little developing grubs inside. There are some designs of bee hotel that you can buy that have little windows on the side, so you can watch the little baby bees developing, which is, oh, someone's just put the YouTube link up. Very good.
I just did that.
Yeah, very good. So yeah, so you can, I mean, which is great fun for kids to kind of peek inside and you know, watch the little piles of pollen being consumed by these funny little fat grubs.
Good.
So,
Yeah, no,
all
I did just put the YouTube channel on the chat function. So if you want to just copy and paste that to somewhere else whilst you're watching this event, that would be great. I've only got one question left, actually. It's John Allen. In what way has climate change affected bumblebees? Yeah,
so bumblebees are weird insects in that they thrive in cold places. If you look at the global distribution of bumblebees, their sort of hotspots are in the Alps and in Scandinavia and the Himalayas, cool places basically, which is really unusual for most insects like sunshine and warmth and the tropics and so on. Which obviously tells you that bumblebees aren't going to like it getting hotter because they're big and furry as an adaptation to thriving in cool climates basically. And so there's already evidence that at the southern edges of their ranges in Europe and North America, bumblebees are disappearing. So the ranges are kind of contracting northwards at the bottom. But the sad thing is the northern edges don't seem to be advancing north. So it's not that the ranges are sort of shifting towards the poles. The ranges are getting squashed from the bottom, but the top isn't moving, which is really worrying. And you know, the obvious question is, why aren't they moving northwards as it gets warmer? And it's probably just because the habitat isn't there, or that they're persisting in small populations in nature reserves like we were talking about earlier, and they can't get northwards. But anyway, the long-term prospects are quite worrying. I mean, one of the many reasons why we need to tackle climate change and keep warming below 1.5 degrees, because if it ends up +2 or 3 degrees, most of our bumblebees will be gone.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the predictions for the climate and biodiversity, they can seem pretty bleak and overwhelming. But I guess to come back to something we were talking about at the beginning, that, you know, it feels like individuals are starting to have more confidence that their actions, no matter how small they seem, can collectively really make a difference. And I guess, is that one of the things that what do you hope to see come from gardening for bumblebees? What's your vision for what people do?
Well, I mean, I've already sort of touched on that. I have this sort of, you know, optimistic dream of the nation's gardens all being slightly wilder and full of bee-friendly flowers and all the rest of it, and all the road verges and everything else that I mentioned. But we also need to think about farming, and because actually the bulk of the land, 70% of Britain, is farmland. And that has mostly become pretty hostile to wildlife. We need to find another way of feeding everybody. And that's difficult. It's difficult to change. I mean, I think there are, sorry, we've opened a whole can of worms that could take hours to properly. But
Ben will just shut us down, it's fine.
there are we basically, in a nutshell, we need to find, I don't think the current farming system is sustainable because it's wiping out wildlife, it's damaging the soil, it's polluting the atmosphere, it's contributing to climate change, it's rubbish in almost every way, and it's hugely inefficient. And there are much better ways of feeding people. We essentially need to find a way of kind of working with nature rather than against it. And there are some lovely models out there. Agroforestry, biodynamic farming, organic farming, permaculture. There's some really interesting ideas. We just need to really explore them and push in that direction. But you can all help again by what you buy local food from sustainable producers, buy organic food, buy seasonal food. Don't buy grapes flown in from South Africa or Chile or whatever. You know, those choices, they might seem small, but if everybody does them, that's really powerful.
Wow. Well, can I just say a huge word of thanks, firstly to you, Dave, for agreeing to take part in this. It's a wonderful. It seemed like a random event where Polly popped in the shop and asking to put some bee-related material in our shop window. To having the guru of bees on our YouTube, on our Zoom channel and our YouTube channel afterwards. So massive thanks to you, Dave. Thank you to all the audience who've joined us. Alice represents a plethora of the most wonderful people who are willing to help the shop out with interviews and stuff. I'm so blessed to have such incredible people, really, who are remarkable in their trade in terms of their day jobs, willing to help the shop. So thank you, Alice, once again. I mean, you've done one or two for me. So all in all, thank you, everyone, and you have a wonderful evening. Dave, got anything planned apart from saving other animals from?
I think I might go and make a gin and tonic, actually.
Are you letting the pheasant
release
out
the
first?
pheasant?
Release
yeah,
the pheasant.
maybe I'll make a gin and tonic for the pheasant.
But, well, you know, I've been enjoying a gin and tonic midway through. So thank you all, and have a great evening. And I'm sure we can get you back to Tring for a physical event at some point very soon.
Thanks, Alice. It was great.
Thank you, guys.
Lovely to meet you.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Cheers.